It's good to be with you tonight as I talk about maturity differences in orchard grass and alfalfa and their implications for forage quality. I mentioned last night that I would talk a little bit more about our forage website. So easiest way to get there is just Google KY Forages. You can see things like our upcoming events by clicking here. You can go directly to our YouTube channel or Google KY or UK YouTube or KY Forages YouTube. You can go to the Hay and Forage link here. I mentioned that yesterday. There's several publications there. I'll talk a fair bit about the link to the variety trials publications as I move through the evening. So for example, when I clicked on the hay and storage, I could see the list of resources. I can see the list of publications over here on the right. If I go down to the Baleage frequently asked questions, that pops up. The last page of that we mentioned last night, there's a technique for measuring moisture content of forage using a microwave oven. Again, back on the hay and storage website, if you go down to haymaking weather, Jordan mentioned that last night. Click on that. You can enter your zip code, UK Ag Weather Center website. That gives you the weather information, the forecast for your exact location. I like to scroll down to the bottom of that. The most useful table I found is the 3-hour by 3-hour forecast. And as Jordan talked about last night, one of the most useful things here from a haymaking standpoint is the drying conditions. Obviously, right now with the cool weather, we don't have very good drying conditions, but you move into the late spring and summer, this is a very helpful thing to look at. You see other things like spraying condition, livestock cold stress condition. So useful website. But the main point of the talk is talking about maturity and talking about how that relates to quality. Most of the presentation, Chris talked a lot about quality. Most of what I'll talk about is just how you determine the maturity of orchard grass, how you can determine the maturity of alfalfa, how you can go about selecting the varieties that would be desirable. Tom Keene last night showed this particular graph, the effect of growth stage on digestibility in yield. So as plants grow larger, the yield increases. The digestibility decreases. This is something you've probably heard us talk about at many meetings. So yield increases, digestibility decreases. Our goal for cutting is a good compromise between digestibility or quality and yield. So when the grass is heading and the legume is at a bud stage, that's a great time to harvest. The limitation is getting both of those to happen at the same time. And with alfalfa, when it's at a bud stage in the spring, most orchard grass varieties are already heading. The quality is already going down. If you're selling it into a high value market, often you will not be able to get as good of a price because the seed heads will be there. So your goal is to cut at a boot stage or just when the head's coming out with the orchard grass and at that late bud stage for alfalfa. So the effect of growth stage on alfalfa quality, Chris talked about this in a lot more detail, but you see the bud stage, TDN of 62 in this example, crude protein close to 20, ADF of 31. It drops quickly as you move into the 10th bloom stage in the half bloom stage. So your goal is cutting at that late bud stage. And then with grasses, this example is with fescue hay, but would be much the same with orchard grass hay. So at the late boot stage, the seed head is just about to come out. Crude protein is 14%. The digestibility are similar. This would be similar to TDN is 68. Early bloom, the crude protein and the digestibility drop. You get into the seed forming stage. So after pollination, and you've got a significant drop in digestibility. So again, cutting when the orchardgrass would be at the late boot stage, and the alfalfa at a late bud stage. So let me talk about how you're going to get an orchardgrass that's going to be at that boot stage or just very early heading when the alfalfa is ready to cut. So you're not compromising one or the other. I wrote an article a couple of years ago in Hay and Forage Grower on orchardgrass maturity, why it matters. So here's an orchardgrass that's really too far along. The seed head is fully emerged. You've actually, Jimmy Henning took this picture, excellent picture. You can even see the anthers or where the pollen is coming off. So you don't want it to go to this stage. So let me focus on a figure or a table that we put together for that publication in Hay and Forage Grower. So we have maturity ratings across the top. And this test, this was conducted over 3 years in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Utah, Virginia, and Wisconsin. So the data is quite robust across the country. We have the varieties listed here. Notice in any table or figure that you look at, make sure you see what the footnote says. So in this case, the lower numbers would be a late maturing variety. 4 or the higher numbers would be an early maturing variety. So the one that has the lowest numbers here is Barlegro. So in Kentucky, it was latest of anything that was there, and it was late at the other locations as well. In fact, let me highlight the ones that are late. So Barlegro, Escada, Exalate, SA, and Harvestor. Several of you I know I've talked to before have used Harvestor, but there's several other options here. They all fall in that late category. Now you may notice that in Wisconsin, there's not very much difference between the maturity. What happens as you move further north, it's cold, there's snow on the ground. When grass starts to grow, often the day length is long enough to stimulate that grass to go to heading. And so this is pretty well universal across all grass species. They're often a much tighter window for heading. So data from Wisconsin, at least this particular year was not, or these years was not as useful, but we have the other locations. So we've got several choices there. Now, I did want to point out 2 other things here. There's 2 circles that are not highlighted. One is pin late. So just because the name says late, don't assume that that means it's late. This is an older public variety, and there could have been some shift happening in seed production. There could have been something else happening, but the long and the short is that pin late now, you can't be confident that it is a late maturing variety. In fact, it's one of the earlier maturing in this test. Prophet is another one that in a number of tests, even in our Kentucky test, it is a later maturing variety, but in this across several states, Virginia is the only place that it actually was late maturing. Now, I did want to point out that there's several varieties that are very early maturing, meaning that the seed heads are coming out very quickly. Benchmark Plus, Persist, Prairie, one developed at the University of Kentucky. You might ask why you're talking about this. You're mainly talking about late. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is because the early maturing, they tend to be the ones that survive better, have better persistence. So if your main goal was planting an orchard grass that you said, I want the best assurance it's going to have long-term survival or persistence, then in our environment, the early maturing would be better. But in talking about planting in combination with alfalfa so that we have that boot stage on the orchard grass and the flowering stage or the bud stage before flowering with alfalfa, then you would not be planting these early maturing. I'll give a couple more examples of this in a moment. So if you go to our Forage website, click on Forage Variety Trials, this is what you'll see. We've got all the different reports. I'm going to talk about the orchard grass report the most, but I do want to highlight the 2020 long-term summary. I'm mentioning this because this contains a table for each of the forage species that we test. And you see those listed, the list of tables on the right side. We've also got our grazing test. So this is probably, or it is, the most useful single publication to look at how varieties rank as far as their yield or their comparison to each other. I'll show a table on this in a little bit, but for right now, I want to talk about the 2020 Orchardgrass Report. And first of all, I want to thank and highlight Jean Olson, our UK Variety Test Coordinator. Jean's done this for a number of years, tremendous expertise, very hard worker. Jean is managing one of the largest forage variety testing programs in the country, mainly single-handedly. So thank you, Jean. Now, let me point out before I move into the tables, the maturity scale that Jean uses. So when the orchard grass is ready to harvest, for the first harvest, when the seed heads are starting to come out, he looks at each variety and he makes he gives a rating. So 45 would mean that that variety is at a boot stage. 50 would mean that's at the beginning of seed head emergence. 58, the seed head has completely emerged. And 62 is at the beginning of pollen shed, meaning you're starting to see that dust, that pollen coming out. So this is from the actual report. This is the table I'm going to refer to, but I've taken an enlargement and obviously turned it right side up. And so let me focus on several tables from this 2020 report. So this table, you see the varieties on the left. We've got a rating of seedling vigor, how quickly these plants were coming up there when they were planted in fall of 2017. Then you've got maturity. And again, remember, a 50 would be that seed head is just starting. The main point, though, is that the lower numbers relate to or equate with the later maturing varieties, meaning they have not matured yet. I'm going to move my image here just a little bit over so you can see that last part of the table. So Treposno, Aldebaran, Lyra, and Berta are all late maturing varieties. We see the first year what their maturity is, and I'm not so worried about the exact maturity, but the fact that it is, these have not, they're still in the boot stage. They've not started heading like some of the other ones. 2019, everything's a little bit later along, but again, these four varieties are later. Now there's Treposno is close to the Potomac, so that could be a concern, but when we look at the last year, they're all much more immature, much later than the top ones. So we're kind of looking at what happens over several years, not just 1 year. We don't want it to change completely. We don't want to move from late maturing to the very earliest maturing one. But in this case, we can feel pretty comfortable that those four are late maturing varieties. Now, another part of the table, if you look at the whole table and lay it out, is the percent stand. Because obviously we want late maturing, but we want varieties that will survive well. I commented earlier that sometimes you don't get as good a persistence. So when we look at these four varieties, they had very good percent stands the first year. This is the spring and the fall of the first production year. Continue to have good survival the second production year. The survival has started to drop off a bit during that third year, particularly by the end of the season. And that would be in comparison to the varieties here. I commented about how varieties like Persist and Prairie have typically better survival. And you see that in those numbers. In the SS0708, that's the new variety that Southern States is selling that has replaced Benchmark Plus. So look at our tables for things like maturity we're talking about today, but also making sure varieties survive well. Now, in some of our other tests, these varieties have survived, but that's a question mark and something as you're thinking about how long do you want the stand to survive. So moving to another table, this was planted in 2016. This is our 2019 Orchardgrass Report. I've highlighted the varieties Alpine 2, Echelon, Devour, and Invalon. Those varieties are later maturing. I won't point out the early maturing because our main point is the late maturity. And again, you see the numbers move around a little bit, but those fall in the later maturing group each of those years. So that gives us some confidence that there's some other choices for late maturing varieties. And I'm going to summarize all of these at the end. So don't worry about trying to write all this down right now. Now, moving on to another test, this orchard grass test. This was planted in the fall of 2019, and we're planting all of these in very late August, early September. So the seedling vigor would be a month and a half later. So Echelon, Prophet, in this Bar Optima variety, BARDGLHLR, those are all later maturing varieties. Remember though, earlier I commented that Prophet in that 5-state test was later maturing in Virginia, but not as late maturing in the other states. So even though this one test we saw it, you don't want to depend on it being late maturing. The other comment is the first year, so planted in the fall, the maturity that next spring often is not consistent with what the maturity will be the second, the third, the fourth year. So another reason I'm showing this is you don't want to depend on the maturity rating from just that first spring. It's useful to see. You don't want to depend on it. Okay, another test. This is in the 2017 orchard grass report. Several varieties overlap that we had before. And I'll give an example here with Prophet. So you see 4 late maturing varieties. Prophet, though, was late maturing that first year, but became one of the earlier maturing the second year. Many people ask me, well, okay, I want to choose one of these late maturing varieties that you mentioned. How do I know who sells it? How do I know who sells it in Kentucky? So genes included in the report, that 2020 report, table 9 here, has the varieties and has the companies that either the distributor or the one that entered it in the test. So you may look one of these up and find out that company is not in Kentucky, but if you look them up online, you get a phone number, call them, or on their website and find out who distributes in Kentucky. Now I want to talk about yield, and I'm going to highlight the varieties that we feel confident about. This is from table 10 of that 2020 orchard grass report. This table is also in the summary publication that I mentioned a little bit earlier. So let me highlight this closer so you can read it. So from all that I've talked about so far, the late maturing orchard grass with Kentucky trials are the ones listed right here. And what you see here, this list of numbers, you say, well, that doesn't look like yield numbers. That doesn't look like tons per acre. These are percentages. These are comparing each variety to how they did to other varieties that have been tested. And so 100 would be average. And the goal would be you have close to 100, close to average or better than average. Now, the late maturing varieties don't tend to be the highest yielding. Part of that is because we're cutting them at a boot stage. Some of the other varieties are cut at that early heading stage. But your goal is probably not the top yield, is to have that late maturity that matches well with alfalfa. The other point I want to make before you say, well, I'm going to plant this particular variety, is in parentheses on that summary table, we list how many times that variety has been tested. So you would rather choose a variety, maybe Harvestor, it's right at 100, but it's been in 6 different tests. So you have a lot more confidence for how it's going to yield. So again, all of these are late maturing. The numbers you're seeing is the yield. I want to mention another initiative that's being worked on, and this is called the Cool Season Grass, or there's a Cool Season Grass Maturity Committee, but I just check here to make sure I'm on time. American Forage and Grassland Council has started this committee. It has representatives from BLF Pick Seed USA, Barenbrug, USA, Grassland, Oregon seed. Also, I represent it with the University of Kentucky, Michigan State. I want to thank my technician, Gabriel Roberts, who's done a lot of help with this in helping distribute seed. The goal is to develop a standardized rating scale that not only can identify, for example, the earliest and latest orchard grass, but also give a comparison across grass species. You'll hear a lot more about the results from this committee, but let me just show you one figure. So this is data taken across from Oregon, Iowa, and Kentucky tests that these companies have been running up from starting back in 2017. There's been several tests. This is an overall average. Krista Lay and that works for me, and Kim Cassada in Michigan State pulled this data together. Okay, my main point is that if we look at orchard grass, you see a range of maturity from day 125. Day one would be January 1st. So we're looking here in April. So maturity from day 125 all the way up to day 140. That maturity rating of orchard grass, so that's useful to know, but it's also useful to know that if you wanted to plant orchard grass and tall fescue together, then you could pick varieties. One of the goals of this project and this committee is how could I choose a variety of fescue that would match well with the maturity of orchard grass? Or maybe you want to plant Timothy and orchard grass together. You could choose a very late maturing orchard grass that could match up to a very early maturing Timothy. So I'm mainly mentioning this because we're trying to come up with a more standardized protocol. We're trying to come up with more consistent information. We're trying to come up with varieties of orchard grass that we can be confident are always late maturing in different parts of the country, and other ones that would be early maturing, and to do this across all the grass species. Now let me move into alfalfa in the bit of time that I have left. You go to alfalfa.org, you go to the National Alfalfa and Forage Alliance website, a nice publication here called Alfalfa Germination and Growth. And I just want to point out, our goal is cutting at the late bud stage. Not a great photo here because it's taken from that publication. Download that publication to see it in more detail. But we've got good quality and we've got good yield. Some people wait to early flower, sometimes we say 10% flower, but definitely don't want to go any later than that. And again, 10% flower doesn't mean that 10% of the whole field has flowers. It means that 10% of the stems have a flower that's open. So visually, you just see a few flowers out there. This is a report that's on that alfalfa.org website. Very useful information across the board, but I want to talk about fall dormancy, and you'll see why I'm talking about fall dormancy in just a second. So alfalfa ranges in dormancy or fall dormancy from 1, very dormant, to 11, very non-dormant. And a photo I took years ago in Georgia, Florida 77. This is in the middle of the fall in Georgia. I'm continuing to grow. Fall dormancy of 9, meaning it does not go dormant for winter. It doesn't need to prepare for winter. Variety that will grow well in Florida, Southern California, but would die out over winter here because it continues to grow. Travois, an older variety, fall dormancy of a 1. This is something you plant in Alaska or northern Canada in the agricultural areas because it goes dormant or slows its growth down very early in the fall. And so it's going to survive the winter great, but it's not something we'd ever think about planting in Kentucky. So this is what the chart looks like. Not only can you see fall dormancy on the left side, so the fall dormancy 2, fall dormancy 3, 4, 5. Many of the varieties available in the US are in the 4 and 5 range. And you can see the disease resistance, insect resistance as well. I'm going to read through several things. Listen closely because dormancy fits in with maturity or flowering date. So as varieties move from dormant to non-dormant, the non-dormants flower sooner than the dormant ones. True throughout the growing season, not just in the fall. So if a grower wanted to stretch out the harvest window with alfalfa, they could plant a fall dormant 4 on some fields, and 5 in other fields. Fall dormancy 5 would typically flower several days before fall dormancy 4. Parts of the country that have large acres, producers have large acres, they're doing this method to try to stretch out their timing of harvest. In Kentucky, fall dormancy 4 and 5 will survive our winters. If someone was very concerned about winter injury, maybe a severe winter cold, a 4 would be a little bit safer, but usually both of these do well. Again, the fall dormancy 5 would have a little more growth in the fall of the year. Fall dormancy 3 would flower a little bit even later, but you'd sacrifice a lot of yield in the fall because that growth is slowing down. And most alfalfa companies don't specifically market varieties based on maturity or flowering dates because the differences are quite small. Do want to mention a couple though. Dairyland hybrid alfalfa varieties tend to remain vegetative longer than other varieties, flower somewhat later in the growth cycle. So that's something to consider. Alpha-Rex has their high ton varieties that are selected for a faster rate of growth per day, reach maturity 2 to 3 days faster than other varieties. Ford Genetics is probably the largest alfalfa breeding company, distributes through a number of marketing companies. Their primary focus is new varieties with rapid regrowth, high yield, and persistence. They're doing some work right now on trying to stretch out the maturity, but they're not marketing anything with that now. But they do have varieties like the couple of American Maristan I mentioned here that show fast recovery. And the last one there, 457 RR, so that's a Roundup Ready variety. So a fast recovery variety coming back quicker, then that could match maybe better with a early maturing orchard grass that's putting the seed heads up sooner. Remember also the reduced lignin alfalfa, the Harv Extra varieties. These varieties, they're going to mature at a similar stage to anything else, but they're maintaining their quality even when they're flowering. So they're, as Chris talked about quality yesterday and Tom talked about quality, they're going to maintain that quality even into that early flowering stage. So that could be an option when you're trying to stretch out your cutting schedule. So let me just summarize. Look for consistently late maturing orchard grass varieties from our University of Kentucky trials. Make sure you check for persistence and yield when selecting varieties. Alfalfa maturity or flowering date has less variation than grasses, but can vary by 2 to 3 days, particularly based on fall dormancy. Glad to answer any questions and encourage you to look at our Forage website for more detail on the publications that I talked about. Thank you.